Snow clawed at the metal skin of the armored truck, a constant whisper rising to a roar every time the wind funneled down the valley. The sky above was an overexposed sheet of white. Clouds pressed low over the ridgelines like a lid. In that flattened daylight, distance was hard to judge. Everything was white or rock or shadow. The first hint that something was wrong came as a sound no one could quite place. Corporal Ortiz heard it first. It threaded through the engine noise and clatter of gear inside the troop compartment. Something thin and distant, like a branch snapping very far away. He lifted his head, the belt of 5.56 rounds across his chest clinking softly. "You hear that?" he asked. Next to him, a medic in a stained jacket kept his eyes on the casualty card he was updating, pen scratching. "Hear what?" Outside, on the valley floor, the convoy crawled along the single lane carved into the packed snow. 6 armored trucks, 1 lightly armored boxy vehicle bristling with antenna masts at the center, and a smaller utility truck bringing up the rear. The sides of the valley rose steep and close, cluttered with rocks and white drifts that looked like frozen waves. On top of the third vehicle, under the shield of a hatch, a young soldier manned the gun, gloved hands wrapped around the handles. He was humming under his breath fogging the air, eyes darting between the slopes and the gray smear of sky. He never finished the verse. The explosion erupted beneath the lead vehicle. For a heartbeat, the road itself seemed to bulge. Snow and dirt and fire collided upward in a dirty plume, flipping the first truck onto its side. The roar hit the rest of the convoy a moment later, a slammed door of sound that punched through armor and bone alike. The lead truck spun as if yanked by an invisible hand and crashed into the slope, blocking the path ahead with 100 tons of smoking metal. Inside the third truck, everyone lurched forward, harnesses biting into shoulders. Someone yelled. Another laughed once, a sharp, unbelieving bark. The laughter died as a second blast detonated behind them. The last truck in the column bucked, rear wheels shattering, engine blocks spitting shrapnel. Flames poured out of its hood and crawled along fuel lines in a hungry orange streak. The driver never got his door open. In seconds, the line was sealed front and back. A perfect cork in the valley. Lieutenant Mason tasted copper. He'd bitten his tongue when he slammed against the radio rack. He pushed himself up, shoving loose equipment out of the way, ears ringing. The long-range radio set in front of him buzzed, then fell into a flat hiss. "Report," he shouted, voice scraping his throat raw. On the other side of the armored bulkhead, the central vehicle, the intel and comms truck, sat like a nervous heart, its antenna dishes pointed skyward. Inside, hard drives hummed, and encrypted relays rested in their racks, holding the eyes and ears of the brigade. Above them, the slopes came alive. Muzzle flashes winked from rocks and scoops in the snow, as small as cigarette burns from the valley floor. A heartbeat later, rounds began punching into steel. The sound of it was like hail on a tin roof, except every impact could peel metal and bone. The gunner on the third truck ducked instinctively, then rose to return fire. He got off half a dozen short bursts before a round caught him in the shoulder. The impact spun him sideways. He dropped behind his shield with a strangled grunt. On the second truck, a machine gun roared, tracers lashing at the right-hand ridge. Another rifle opened up from the rear, then stalled as its truck burned hotter. "Get that smoke out. Get the wounded under cover," Mason yelled. His voice seemed thin against the ripping thunder of incoming fire. A mortar round whistled in and landed farther up the valley, a scattering impact that showered snow over the disabled lead vehicle. A second round landed closer, bracketing the convoy. The third slammed into the road near the forward observer, who was crouched with his tablet. The blast pitched him into the snow, headphones flipping off, tablet tumbling away. "Long-range comms, what V you got?" Mason demanded, leaning over the radio operator. The young specialist twisted dials with gloved fingers. The headset pressed against his cap hissed and popped. "Sir, I'm not getting anything. Just a wall of noise. Switch bands. Try the SAT channel. I've tried them. It's all dead." The lieutenant looked up through the armored glass slit. The antenna masts on the intel truck stood out like thin spears against the white. He could feel his world shrinking, becoming only this valley, these vehicles, the invisible guns on the slopes. Another mortar round landed closer still. The shock wave slammed through the armor, turning everything into vibrating metal. Someone was screaming. Someone else was yelling for a medic. Snow poured in through a cracked window frame, dusting the floor. Out on the valley floor, a figure moved low between vehicles. Thin, compact, rifle slung. She slid along the lee side of a truck, boots kicking through churned snow, head down as rounds snapped overhead. Her breath came in controlled bursts, not quite steady but disciplined. Rifling slung across her back, bullet handle dark against the pale world. Corporal Nadia Rafik dropped behind the wheel well of the intel truck and pressed her shoulder into cold armor. "Corporal, stay put," someone shouted above the din, voice distorted by the adrenaline in it. "I can't see where they're walking that mortar in from here," she replied, more calmly than she felt. She risked a glance around the corner. The right-hand ridge loomed close, its slope broken by rock outcrops and drifts. Somewhere up there, a spotter watched through glass, adjusting each round. Somewhere else, RPG teams cradled their launchers, waiting for a lull. A bullet slapped the armor inches from her face, leaving a bright, fresh scar. She ducked back. Farther down the line, Ortiz had his arms hooked under a driver's armpits, dragging the limp body out of a seat slick with blood. The medic scrambled beside him, kneeling in the snow as rounds punched little spurts all around them. "Just give me 10 seconds," the medic yelled, hands already tearing open a bandage. 10 seconds. Nadia shifted. Over the storm of sound, she heard something different now. Voices bouncing around in her memory. An officer in a warm room saying, "Do not deviate from your lane." The echo of a reprimand on paper. A name, hers, printed under the words "failure to follow instructions." Another mortar whistled in. This one landed so close that the shock drove the breath from her lungs. For a surreal second, the roar cut out. The world became a ringing pressure. In that ringing silence, she saw it. On the upper right ridge, something moved just at the edge of the haze. A figure shouldering a tube. The faint, unmistakable angle of a rocket-propelled grenade launcher settling into place. The tube pointed not at a random truck, but at the intel vehicle. The one with the encryption keys and relay gear. The target they wanted most. Time compressed. Snow spun through the air like static. The man with the launcher twisted slightly, centering his sight. Around him, muzzle flashes flared. Nadia swung her rifle around, hands moving faster than thought. Bolt lifted and driven forward, magazine seated, cheek pressed to the stock. The optic filled with white, then the darker shape of rock, then the slight ridge where the RPG team was tucked into a scoop. Her crosshairs trembled over the slim shape of an exposed arm, a portion of the tube. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She exhaled and let the breath leave her chest. Sound dropped out. The battle became something distant. An old recording turned low. Her finger took up the slack in the trigger. The recoil was a familiar punch into her shoulder. The report of the rifle was a single, flat crack against the valley walls. In the optic, the man with the launcher jerked. The tube wobbled, sagged. He collapsed sideways, the launcher half-shouldered. The rocket slid free, falling into the snow beside him and sputtering harmlessly in a weak spit of flame. Down on the valley floor, men who had braced for the inevitable flash of a launch stared at the silent ridge, not quite processing what had happened. The RPG had not fired. The truck they expected to see engulfed in flame remained intact, peppered by small arms, but untouched by that final, catastrophic hit. "Who fired that?" Mason shouted, scanning his own troops, his voice edged with disbelief. His radio operator looked up, eyes wide. "Sir, no one here has angle on that." On the opposing slope, a machine gun fell silent. Fighters shouted in a language Mason didn't know, their voices edged with a new note: uncertainty. They'd done everything right. The charges, the bracketing mortars, the overlapping fields of fire. They'd cut the valley in half and pinned the prey. Yet something on the ridge above them had just reached into the kill zone and snatched a victory away with one bullet. Mason's gaze found, briefly, a dark shape tucked behind the intel truck's rear tire. Nadia's cheek was still welded to her rifle. Snowflakes were settling in her hair, melting against the heat rising from her face. Then a fresh wave of fire lashed the vehicles, and he dropped back into cover. The question stayed in the air, unanswered, as the valley shook and burned. 24 hours earlier, the valley had been just a line on a map. The briefing room smelled of coffee and heater fuel. A laminated satellite image was taped to the wall, the valley a thin dark scar through a wash of white. The ridgelines rose like ribs. A red grease pencil line traced the convoy route. Captain Ramon tapped the board with his knuckle. "Resupply to the sensor masts here and here," he said, indicating the end of the route. Intel truck in the middle with the relay package and keys. "We go down, we go back, we keep the pass network alive." Brigade's birds rely on those masts. So does everyone watching the border. A handful of soldiers sat in folding chairs, their cold weather gear half opened, cups of coffee cupped in their hands. A few tried not to yawn. "Threat level?" Mason asked from the second row. He had a pen poised over a notebook, though the mission looked straightforward. "Same as last month's run," Ramon said. "We've had harassing fire on the ridges, maybe some probes. Nothing they could sustain. Quick in and out. Weather window gives us 6 hours of decent visibility before another cell rolls in." He shrugged. "Standard precautions. We don't get sloppy, we don't give them a free shot." At the side of the room, near the heater, Nadia sat at the end of a row, a small notebook balanced on her knee. She was used to this vantage point. Close enough to hear everything, far enough that no one noticed if she left first or last. While the captain spoke, her eyes followed the contour lines on the map. She traced the valley with her gaze, imagining sight lines, folds where someone could dig in a gun. Her thumb rubbed the edge of scar near her left knuckle, a little ridge of tissue that tingled in cold weather. Ramon's gaze swept the room. "Marksman position," he said. "Rafik, you'll ride in 3, same as last time. Stay close to the intel truck. Keep an eye on the right-hand slope. We've had most of the noise from that side. Don't go wandering off. That's what the rest of your squad is for." A few of the others chuckled. Ortiz, sitting one seat over, leaned close. "Guess you're on close guard duty again," he whispered. "Glamorous." She kept her eyes on the map. "They're not sending us on vacation." "You say it like I didn't pack swim trunks," he muttered. Her mouth twitched despite herself. After the briefing, men and women shuffled out, scraping chairs, shaking off drowsiness. The heater growled. Someone turned up a portable radio, a pop song leaking through the static. Over it, Ramon's voice murmured with Mason's as they reviewed details. Nadia approached the front slowly, waiting until the small cluster around the captain thinned. "Sir," she said. Ramon looked over, then at his watch. "Make it quick." She gestured at the section of the map halfway down the valley, where the contours pinched the road close to the right-hand ridge. "Can we adjust the route slightly here?" she asked. "Last week on Overwatch, I saw tracks up on the shoulder. Not ours. Looked like someone had been up there, maybe checking angles. There's also a rock formation here that wasn't in the older imagery. I'd like to get a patrol on it before we send the convoy through." Ramon squinted. "We don't have time to be chasing every set of boot prints in the snow, Corporal," he said. "Engineers have been all over that route." "Could be them. They haven't gone up that shoulder," she said. "Too steep for their gear." The formation looked recent. The snow around it was disturbed. Could be someone dug in a hide or dropped something under the drift. A repeater. A command wire. If they push anything. It's a valley, he cut in. Rocks fall, snow drifts. That pass is a magnet for every bored local looking for a place to stash contraband. We can't clear every rock pile or we'll never move. You'll have your rifle. You see something you don't like, you engage it. That's your job." He turned back to Mason. The dismissal was smooth, practiced. A hand wave to brush away a layer of worry. Nadia stared at the map for a moment longer. The little red line went right between those contours. A perfect corridor. She stepped back, the words she might have said next folding away like paper. On her way out, she nearly collided with Harper, the forward observer, who balanced his targeting tablet in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. "Careful," he said cheerfully, shifting aside. "You break this, and I've got to do math in my head." "Maybe that would build character," she replied, stepping around him. He grinned. "I have plenty of character. None of it involves doing math under fire." Outside the briefing tent, the air slapped her in the face. The outpost crouched on its ridge like a camp on the moon. Prefab huts, HESCO barriers half buried in snow, vehicles lined in neat rows, exhaust plumes curling into the white sky. She walked toward the motor pool, hands tucked into her pockets. The bolt-action rifle lay in her arms like something living, barrel wrapped in a faded cloth to keep the cold from biting bare metal. The stock was worn but cared for. The optic on top carried a dozen range marks scribbled on tape. Outdated gear for some, but it had never lied to her. At the vehicles, Ortiz hopped down from the true compartment of 3, boots thudding. "You look like you swallowed a grenade," he observed. "Pin still in, but barely." "He doesn't want to reroute," she said. "Says we don't have time to chase ghosts." Ortiz shrugged. He's not wrong. There are ghosts everywhere. You'd run out of bullets. She looked down the ridge at the valley, where wind dragged sheets of snow through the gaps. "Some ghosts carry rifles," she said. He followed her gaze, then shivered theatrically and pulled his scarf up. "Don't jinx it," he murmured. "The last run was boring." "I like boring." "Boring is a lie we tell ourselves," she said. "Wow, deep." He shoved his hands into his gloves. "You should put that on a coffee mug." As she checked the rifle, adjusting the turret, running a cloth over the lenses, a buzzing sound drifted down from overhead. She paused, frowning. Above the outpost, nearly lost in the overcast brightness, a small shape drifted and dipped. Not big, but visible if you knew what you were looking for. Civilian-style quadcopter, painted white. "Drone," someone muttered near the gate. A sentry snapped up binoculars. "Where'd that come from?" Mason demanded, emerging from behind a vehicle. "Could be one of ours," Ortiz suggested. "It's not on our schedule," Mason said. "Shut it down if you can." By the time someone got a jammer pointed in its direction, the drone had already tilted, scanned the vehicle park, and drifted back toward the mountains. In a dark room on the far side of the range, a man in a heavy coat leaned over a monitor, watching the grainy feed. He tapped the screen where the intel truck sat in the convoy line, its antenna array clearly visible. He nodded to another man, who spoke into a handset. Everything was in place. Back at the outpost, the convoy engines started one by one, coughing into life. Warm breath blossomed from exhaust pipes. Soldiers tightened straps and adjusted helmets. Nadia slid into her spot near the rear of Vehicle 3, half inside the hatch, half out. From this perch, she could pivot to scan the right-hand slope or swing left if needed. Her hand rested on the cold rail, fingers flexing. She swept her rifle's optic across the distant valley entrance, tracing where the route would wind. She found a rock formation she'd mentioned. Even from here, it looked a shade too regular. Snow piled around it differently than its neighbors. "See that?" she asked Ortiz, who climbed up beside her, his carbine hanging on its sling. "See what?" He squinted. "Looks like a rock to me." "Exactly." He laughed. "You're making less sense by the minute." "You didn't see it last week," she said. The snow line was different. There was a narrow cut on its right flank. Footprints. Someone took the trouble to go up there. "Training area," he suggested. "Random explorer. Overachieving mountain goat. Pick your poison." "You'll see," she murmured. He clapped her shoulder. "I prefer not to see. I like going out and then coming back with all my bits attached." The convoy rolled. They descended from the ridge into the valley like a small steel centipede, tracks biting into the packed white. The world narrowed as the slopes closed in, ridges shouldering up on both sides. The sky seemed to drop lower. The wind changed tone, whistling through rock teeth. For the first 30 minutes, nothing happened. Snow blew in small, lazy gusts. The engines hummed. Someone on internal comms made a joke about hot showers waiting back at the base. Harper's voice drifted from the lead vehicle, coordinates rattling off as he checked reference points. Nadia scanned. Left ridge, clear. Right ridge, shadows, rocks, occasional glints that turn out to be ice. She paused on the rock formation when it finally came into view up close. Up here, it loomed larger, a cluster of boulders with a slightly unnatural symmetry. Her scope picked out a thin line in the snow near its base. Something like a cable, half exposed by a recent gust. Her lips pressed together. "Lieutenant, this is 3, she said in her handset. "I've got eyes on that formation. There's definitely something up there. I recommend we halt and put a team on it before we go under its arc." Static hissed for a second. Then Mason's voice came through, strained with the effort of managing vehicles in tight formation. "-3. We're committed to the route. We stop here. We're stuck between those slopes if weather moves in. We clear it when we reach the mass site and come back with more time." She watched the cable disappear into the snow. "Copy," she said, not trusting herself to argue more over an open net. Ortiz leaned out beside her, following her line of sight. "Still just a rock," he said, but there was less humor in it now. The valley pinched. The walls grew closer. Nadia's shoulders tensed. She could feel, in her bones, the way the terrain channeled fields of fire. How you could set up overlapping arcs with half a dozen rifles and a mortar team and make this road a place people didn't leave. "Armor spacing," Mason called over the net. "Keep distance, no bunching." A gust of wind blew a curtain of fine snow across their path. Visibility dropped, then cleared. That was when the first blast came. From there, everything accelerated toward the moment on the ridge, the shot that punched through the future and rewrote it. Back in the present, as small arms fire chewed at the valley, the convoy's world constricted further. Mason kept his shoulder to the radio operator, barking into the handset. "Bravo 1, this is Valkyrie. Ambush in progress. Valley Grid 417 by 621. We are engaged and pinned. Request immediate artillery and air support. Danger close. How copy?" Static answered. I said, "How copy?" Anyone on this net respond. The radio hissed at him like a snake. The operator's face was pale beneath his helmet. "Sir, something's burning the whole band. This isn't just terrain. It's intentional." On the slopes, flashes of light marked each mortar launch. The rounds screamed overhead and dropped in a deadly pattern, each one closer than the last. Someone had done the math well. Someone with a spotter and coordinates. In the center of the column, the intel truck shuddered as rounds hit its front armor. Inside, the team hunkered down among racks of humming equipment, the air thick with the smell of hot electronics and fear. "If that truck goes up, the brigade loses the pass for days," Harper had said in the briefing. "And anyone out there in those days is blind." Nadia moved, letting training override the primal urge to curl up in whatever hollow she could find. She scuttled along the truck's flank between impacts, each step picked for where the snow and metal might give her just enough cover for the next half second. Her world narrowed to 4 things: where the next round would likely impact, where her next step would fall, what she could see through her optic, and the voices on the net. 2 is hit. 2 is hit. Driver down. Medic. I need a medic up here. We're taking fire from both ridges, I repeat. A mortar blast cut that voice off. She pressed herself into the valley wall long enough to raise her optic and sweep the upper ridges. Fast, but not frantic. Fast in a way that still allowed noticing. That cable near the rock formation wasn't just a cable. Now, in the flashes of mortar fire, she saw boxes half buried in snow near its base. Thin antenna rods stuck up like weeds. Every time the mortars landed, a tiny LED blinked on one of the boxes. Jamming node. Maybe the first in a network. She swung farther, scanning the ridgeline beyond. On a knob of rock opposite, a slim figure in a heavier coat stood with binoculars pressed to his face. At his feet, a handheld radio. Mortar team spotter. He was partially tucked behind a boulder, but his upper torso and head were exposed enough. She adjusted for range by instinct. The valley air was cold and dense. She remembered the way her round struck on the range in similar weather, slightly low at longer distances. Her finger tapped the trigger guard once, twice. "Lieutenant," she said softly into her cracked radio. "I've got eyes on the spotter." No response. The net was clogged with overlapping shouts and bursts of static. She shot anyway. The man with the binoculars jerked backward, dropping his radio. For a moment, he stood there, oddly straight, then folded over the rock and slid down out of sight. Half a minute passed. No mortar rounds fell. Down in the valley, bodies moved in that sudden, fragile lull. Go, 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 someone yelled. Soldiers dashed from trucks to drag wounded into the lee of the vehicles or into shallow ditches kicked into the snow. The medic lay flat, pressing his hands into a chest wound, his own sleeves flecked with blood. Ortiz fired short, controlled bursts at the slope, keeping enemy heads down, then shoved a spare magazine into a trembling private's hands. Count your rounds, he warned. You'll want them later. The reprieve didn't last. On a different knob, another figure took up binos and a radio. The first dead spotter had been a piece, not the whole. This new one ducked behind rock between each adjustment, as if already wary of an unseen eye. The mortars resumed, less precise at first, then tightening as the new spotter found a range. An RPG streaked from the left ridge, barreling toward the rear vehicle that was already burning. The rocket slammed into its side and ripped what was left apart, sending a billion fiery shreds into the sky. Lieutenant, Nadia's voice cut into Mason's handset, half buried under other calls. We have to get someone up on that right-hand ridge. They're walking mortars, and they've got jamming on this flank. I can get a vantage and start cutting them out. Negative, he snapped instinctively. Command school lived in his spinal cord. You do not send lone shooters up slopes under active fire. You consolidate, you hold, you wait for support. He looked out at the valley, though, and saw no support coming. Not yet. Not while the radios hissed, and the enemy freaking owned the spectrum. Sir, Harper said, one hand pressed to his ear, face spattered with blood from a cut on his forehead. Even if Artie hears us, I can't mark effectively from here. I can't see where the rounds are originating, just their impacts. They're on the ridge shoulders. We're stuck guessing. It's like calling fire blind. A mortar round hit close enough that the intel truck rocked. Steel groaned. Somewhere inside, a panel fell with a crash. Mason thought of the ridge. Thought of the corporal who never raised her voice in briefings, but saw things others missed. Thought of the reprimand in her file. Disobedience. Deviated from lane. Extracted trainee from wrong sector. Save a life. Cost a clean report. He realized he was clinging to rules that assumed a less prepared enemy and better comms. Rafik, he said into the handset. You still think that ridge is our only play? Yes, sir. The calm in her tone wrapped around a core of something fierce. If they hold that elevation and we stay down here, we bleed out, she continued. Give me a green light. I'll take the right shoulder and work my way to that rock formation. That's at least one jamming node. The spotters are working from near there. From above, I can kill their eyes. Mason's jaw tightened. You leave the convoy. You'll be alone up there, he said. You lose contact. There's no one to pull you out. A mortar round whined overhead. Everyone flinched. It landed just beyond the lead vehicle, showering it with debris. Respectfully, sir, Nadia said. We're already alone down here. He glanced around. He saw the wounded, the pinned, the central vehicle that might as well have had a bullseye painted on it. He saw fear pressed into every angle of metal and posture. Fear was rational here. He also saw a possible line shifting through the impossible. Go, he said, voice low, almost lost under the next volley. You move on your own authority. You see a shot, you take it. Hit anything that talks to mortars or touches a jammer first. There was a tiny pause. Yes, sir, she said. No relief, just acceptance. As if this was the answer she'd expected all along. She took one deep breath, then another. Ortiz popped up beside her as she readied to move. Tell me the plan is something sane, he said, already knowing it wasn't. Depends on your definition, she replied. You staying low and cozy by this truck would be my definition. I'm heading up that gully, she said, nodding toward a narrow cut in the right-hand slope. If I can reach the shoulder, I can see down into their hides. He stared. You're joking. She pushed her remaining full magazines into a pouch high on her chest, where she could reach them even if prone. Left 2 partial mags with him. If the lieutenant asks, I'm just stretching my legs, she said. His mouth opened, then closed. He pulled a band from his pocket, something thin and red, the kind used to secure chem lights. "Take this," he said abruptly. She frowned. "For what?" "So if you fall into a drift, I can find your stubborn corpse," he said. "You slip it on your wrist, yes?" She took it and shoved it into her glove. "You're terrible at encouragement," she said. "That's why you like me," he shot back. Another mortar hit not far from the gully entrance, blasting chunks of packed snow into the air. In the swirling white cloud it created, she moved. She sprinted through the haze, boots punching into snow, body low. Rounds snapped past, tearing faint contrails in the air. One flashed, so close she felt its heat graze her sleeve. The gully's mouth was a jagged notch in the rock, half choked with ice. She dove into it and slammed into the side, panting. Up here, out of the direct line from most of the guns, the sound of the battle dulled slightly. It became more echo and less immediate percussion. She started climbing. Every step was a negotiation. The snow was deceptive, a crust hiding hollows. Sometimes her boot found rock. Sometimes it plunged to the knee, sending a shock up her leg. Her fingers, in their gloves, searched for holds. She kept one hand on the rifle whenever she could, unwilling to let it swing unchecked. Midway up, a blast hit somewhere below, jarred the entire slope. The jolt knocked her sideways. Her shoulders slammed into rock. The rifle bounced off a protrusion, the optic ringing ominously. She grabbed the stock and hugged it to her chest, teeth clenching as she rode out the minor avalanche of loose snow that followed. When it settled, she lay there for a moment, breathing hard, tasting grit. Her radio squawked once, half a word, then went dead. She looked at it. A thin crack had spidered across the casing. The indicator light went from a weak green to nothing. She was on her own now. No net, no updates. Just the memory of Mason's last words and the shape of the valley in her head. She pushed herself up and continued. The higher she climbed, the more the wind bit. It stole heat from her face and any exposed skin in seconds. Snow, stung loose by the gusts, clawed at her eyes. Her lungs burned. But with every meter, her field of view widened. The valley floor shrank. The trucks became toy models in a diorama. The flashes of enemy guns became more distinct, each from its own little hide. She could see movement now, where before there had been only vague threat. Figures running between positions, hauling ammunition. The rock formation loomed above, its underside carved out just enough to create a shallow cave. She slid into its shadow and pressed flat against the cold surface, heart hammering. A cable ran into the hollow, connecting a small repeater box to a rack of batteries. Thin antenna whips poked out of the snow in a messy fan. The repeater's indicator lights pulsed in time with bursts of a signal. Every flash was another smear of static over her comrades' radios. She had one grenade left on her vest. She considered it, then shook her head. If she threw it, she'd announce her position to the whole ridge. Better to be patient. Better to pick targets one by one, and when the moment was right, ruin this node in a way that might also take out those directing it. Lying prone, she scoped the valley. From here, the geometry made brutal sense. The enemy had picked the perfect spot. The valley narrowed so that no vehicle could turn, no column could shift. The high ground on both sides met at a shallow saddle where a handful of shooters could cover every meter of road. Invisible from below until it was too late. On the opposite ridge, the mortar position was obvious now, a dug-in bowl, ringed with stacked snow blocks. Men worked like cogs, loading and adjusting. Farther along, the machine gun that had chewed the medic's cover sat in a recessed notch, its belt draped into an ammo can. From here, she could also see the second spotter, the one who had taken over after her first shot. He moved more carefully, ducking behind his rock between adjustments, as if he sensed the invisible eye tracking him. She drew in a slow breath, aligning crosshairs on the thin gap where his head and shoulder appeared. She fired. He jerked, then sagged. The radio slid from his hand. The next mortar round launched blind and flew wild, slamming into a distant slope and sending an avalanche of snow sliding down an empty face. She shifted to the machine gun nest. The gunner jerked the weapon, sweeping the valley. The medic below was pinned behind a wheel, his world reduced to 8 inches of dirty snow and steel. The gunner's helmet was just visible above his narrow slot. She aimed just to the right of the gun, where she knew he would lean to shout to his loader. As he moved, his head entered the space. She fired again. The gun fell silent. The loader grabbed for the handles, panic in his motions. She put another round into the nest, and he dropped out of sight. Down in the valley, Ortiz felt the pressure ease, marginally. "Somebody up there likes us," he muttered before crawling out to yank a bleeding private into cover. Soldiers who had been pinned began to edge to new positions, dragging wounded, grabbing ammo. On the enemy's side, voices rose higher. Men gestured toward the ridges, pointing at where they thought the unknown shooter might be. While the mortars paused, another device whirred to life. A small drone lifted off from behind the enemy's rocks, its rotors buzzing. It climbed, wobbling slightly in the wind, then stabilized as its operator guided it toward the right-hand ridge. Nadia heard it before she saw it. A faint buzz, different from mortar whine or the boom of rifles. She rolled slightly and spotted the thing as it came over the crest, a white spider against the white sky. Her hide was good, but nothing was perfect from above. She slid to the side, slowly, pressing herself into another patch of shadow. The drone drifted, camera lens turning like an unblinking eye. It lingered over the repeater box and hollow. A shot-out solar panel near the hide had left a distinct pattern in the snow. Her crawling had made a shallow groove. The drone's nose dipped. It wobbled seaward, then sideways, scanning. If she shot it, she would confirm her position. If she didn't, someone below would use that feed to send fire. She had to assume the enemy was competent. They had built this whole trap. They would adapt as soon as they recognized a new threat. She waited, muscles screaming at her to act, to do anything. The drone drifted past, then banked back. Its operator, down on the left ridge, scribbled its path over the monitor with a gloved fingertip. The trail ended near the rock formation. He spoke into his radio. A quick, clipped order. 2 men broke from the line and began climbing toward the gully she'd used, moving fast despite the steep grade. One carried a rifle, the other a satchel of grenades slung across his chest. The hunters had become the hunted. Nadia checked her magazine. Less than half left. She fished another from her pouch, counting silently. A full mag on reserve. A few loose rounds in her pocket. Not much, considering how many directions needed her attention. She shifted slightly, brought her scope down to the valley again. The intel truck still sat in the center, taking sporadic fire. A round had punched through one of its smaller panels, smoke curling from the wound. Ortiz crouched behind the rear wheel of 3, firing short bursts, his shoulders bunched. The medic moved from one wounded soldier to another like a thread stitching through a torn fabric. She saw Harper, bloody but conscious again, crawling toward his tablet, which lay half buried in snow. He reached it, shook the snow off, and pressed its battered screen. The device flickered, but came alive. On comms she could not hear. He began shouting coordinates, even if he had no clear channels, hoping some fragment might escape the jamming net. This was what she worked for, to take bites out of that net until something got through. A voice in her head whispered the old reprimand again. You broke protocol. You moved where you were not assigned. Someone could have been harmed. Someone always could. She settled her scope on the slope where the new spotter might appear, but he was cautious, hidden. Instead, her eye caught a cluster near a bigger, boxier piece of equipment higher up the ridge. A larger jammer unit, cables snaking from it down toward the smaller repeater near her hide. Around it, several men worked, one with a tablet, another talking into a handset. A man in cleaner gear and a distinctive cap stood slightly apart, watching. He gestured, and others moved. A commander. She could feel the weight of his role from here. The way men oriented toward him, even subconsciously. She was at an odd angle to him, more behind than beside. A direct headshot would be challenging through the tangle of machinery and cables. The wind had picked up, tugging at her barrel. Her optic, she realized now that she had time to examine it, had a slight misalignment. The ring around the lens bore a fresh dent, the glass a hair off true. Long-distance precision, the kind she had trained for, had been made unreliable. Her carefully made range cards, her annotated dope, all bent by that small impact against the rock. Except she still had her experience. The feel in her bones of how rounds behaved in cold air, over snow reflecting heat back, through gusts like these. She also had options beyond the standard target. She aimed at the jammer itself. There was a panel on the side, slightly bulged, behind which batteries or power regulation units likely lived. Cables came out of it, wrapped in haste. If she could hit that panel and achieve penetration, there was a chance of catastrophic failure inside. She steadied herself, pulled back mentally from the intense focus, widening her awareness to include wind, breath, temperature. She had always hated when instructors described shots as art, but right now, she understood. This was less equation and more intuition layered over training. She exhaled and pressed her cheek harder into the stock. The dented optics crosshairs rested a fraction off where she would have normally placed them. She compensated by feel. The man in the cap stepped closer to the jammer, tapping its casing with displeasure. He shouted at a tech, who hastened to adjust something. She squeezed. The shot's crack cut through the valley again. Time, for a moment, seemed to hold still, as all war stories claimed it did. Then the panel she'd aimed at bulged outward. A bright flash, more white than orange, blossomed from its seams. The jammer's insides tore themselves apart. The explosion wasn't huge, but it was violent and focused. Shrapnel of metal and plastic shredded the men clustering around it. The man in the cap took the force in his chest and face. He flew backward, arms flung wide, and hit the snow hard. Cables snapped. The repeater near Nadia sparked, its indicator lights flickering, then dying. Down in the valley, radios that had been walls of static suddenly clicked and cleared. "This is Bravo 1. Say again. Fire mission was logged, but we lost your signal. Confirm you are still." Mason hit the transmit key like a man slapping a lifeline. "Bravo 1 to any station. This is Valkyrie 6, he barked. "Ambush in Valley Grid 417 by 621. We are heavily engaged. Jamming appears reduced or offline. Request immediate artillery, air support, and med evac. Friendlies are marked by smoke if we can get it up. We're taking enfilade from both ridges. Danger close is approved." Artillery's calm voice answered, a normality that felt surreal in this inferno. "Valkyrie 6, this is Hammer. We have your grid. Adjusting fire. Splash in 2 minutes." Above, a helicopter pilot's voice crackled through the ether, faint but growing clearer. "Valkyrie, this is Viper. We are 5 minutes out from your location. We'll need a clear LZ and confirmation that heavy fires are suppressed enough to make a run." "We're working that now," Mason said. "Good to hear your voice." In the enemy hides, confusion swept like a cold wind. Men shouted conflicting orders. Some scrambled to check on their commander, whose body lay twisted near the ruined jammer. The drone operator stared at his monitor, where the signal had just cut to black. The climbers halfway up the gully, toward Nadia's position, paused, then shouted to each other, unsure whether to continue or fall back. One of them decided on stubbornness. He gripped his rifle tighter and kept climbing. Nadia heard them before she saw them. Boots scraping on rock. The faint clink of metal gear. The muttered curses of exertion. She rolled to a different small hollow, staying low. If they reached her level, they could toss grenades into the repeater hide and flush her out. Even if they didn't know exactly where she lay, they knew the general area. She scanned downward, catching a glimpse of a helmet and shoulder as a climber pressed himself against the gully wall. There was a patch of overhanging snow and loose rock above him, undercut by the freeze-thaw cycles. It looked ready to go with just the right nudge. She shifted her aim from the man to the hanging lip. Her round punched into the weak seam. For a split second, nothing. Then the entire overhang slumped loose. Snow chunks the size of backpacks and rocks the size of helmets cascaded down. The climber below yelled, then disappeared under the white mass. His partner, farther back, lost his grip as the slope under his boots changed. He slid several meters before catching himself on a protrusion, scrambling desperately to arrest his fall. They weren't dead, probably, but they were no longer climbing toward her. They'd need minutes to sort themselves out, minutes she could not waste. Artillery shells began arriving. The shots had been calculated based on the rough grid, not precise spotter coordinates. They weren't perfect. Some rounds slammed into empty slopes, sending majestic avalanches down unoccupied faces. But others landed close enough to enemy positions that shrapnel pinged off their hides, and men dove for cover. Mason used the chaos to bark new orders. "Smoke out," he commanded. "Mark positions. Red for us. Nothing up on the ridges. Keep your heads down when the birds arrive." Harper, clutching his tablet to his chest, dragged himself behind the intel truck and began sending more refined coordinates now that he could see some of the muzzle flashes and impacts from a different angle. His fingers shook, but his voice over the net was crisp. Nadia focused on what she could still control. The machine gun she'd silenced remained unmanned. Good. The mortar team was disorganized. Good. But there were still RPGs. There were still rifles. There were still desperate men who might decide that if they were going to lose this ambush, they'd at least try to down a helicopter for the cameras. As if summoned by that thought, she saw movement on the left ridge. An RPG team had repositioned, crawling to a new lip that overlooked the valley's rough potential landing area. They adjusted their launcher, eyeing the thin patch of flat road near the intel truck where red smoke had just begun to bloom. If the helicopter came in there, they would have one clean shot at its belly. Her heart rate ticked up. She had so few rounds left. She cycled the bolt, ejecting a spent casing into the hollow near her face. It bounced once on her glove. She grabbed it automatically, without knowing why, and tucked it into a small pocket. Habit, maybe, or some part of her knew this one mattered. The RPG gunner rose to one knee, launcher on his shoulder. His assistant held out a rocket. Wind gusted, making the man sway. The range was long and at an angle, but she had taken worse. She held the crosshairs on the junction where his neck met his shoulder, knowing that if she hit anywhere along that vertical line, it would at least ruin his aim. She fired. The gunner's head snapped back. The launcher sagged. The rocket tipped out of its tube and clattered to the ground, then skittered into the snow, useless. Below, Ortiz looked up just in time to see the figures on the ridge jerk and fall. He raised his fist and hooped once before catching himself and ducking as a stray round cracked nearby. The helicopter's rotor thump became audible, a rhythm beating down the valley. It crested the far lip, nose down slightly, side doors open. Gunners leaned out, scanning. "Valkyrie, Viper has visual," the pilot said. "We see your smoke. Ridge positions still look hot, but degraded. We're coming in fast and low. Be ready to load casualties on first pass." "Copy," Mason said. "We'll get you in and out." As the aircraft flared for landing, enemy fighters on the far ridge tried one last time to rally. A small knot of them rose, firing wildly at the helicopter with rifles and one last belted weapon. Their rounds sparked off its armor, but could not find soft spots at that angle. Nadia's shoulder ached. The muscles around her, I throbbed from squinting through the slightly crooked optic. Her fingers were slow with cold. But she found one more target, an enemy leader down there, waving men forward despite the artillery, trying to salvage something, anything, from this unraveling plan. She put a round into the snow just in front of his left boot, a shot intended not to kill, but to halt. The man stuttered mid-stride, glancing down, then toward the ridge. He hesitated, that small moment of pause rippling out. The fighters behind him faltered. That half-second was enough for the helicopter to touch down, wheels biting into the snow, rotors kicking up a tornado of white. Medics and riflemen rushed forward, carrying stretchers and wounded, heads ducked. Nadia watched Ortiz half-carry, half-drag a soldier with a bandaged head toward the open bay. The medic jogged beside him, keeping pressure on gauze. Harper stumbled on, cradling his tablet as if it were a newborn. The helicopter lifted with a heavy lurch, rising on a column of blown snow and exhaust. As it climbed, a stray last-ditch rocket from somewhere on the left ridge streaked toward it. The angle was off, hurried, badly chosen. The rocket passed under the tail and vanished into the blizzard, detonating on an empty slope. Nadia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had 3 rounds left. Artillery continued for another minute, deliberate, smashing remaining enemy positions. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the valley's fury ebbed. Silence, when it descended, felt obscene. Smoke drifted in slow ribbons. The burning wreck of the rear truck hissed and spat. Snow fell in soft, indifferent flakes. Men and women moved through that quiet like ghosts, checking for survivors, stepping around those who would not leave this valley. Nadia pressed her cheek to the cold rock of the hide, letting her heart beat slow. Her body wanted to shake. She didn't let it. Not yet. Later, they would gather the full story. They would piece together how one person on a ridge had pulled threads until the enemy's careful tapestry fell apart. For now, she just lay there, looking down at the bent world, and thought of the reprimand in her file, the words underlined there: failure to follow instructions. Soon, someone would decide what that meant today. They debriefed 3 days later, back at the outpost. The snow had fallen twice more since the ambush, smoothing some of the scars on the valley's skin. The wrecks still lay there, mute and blackened, but the drifts were already creeping up their sides. Inside the briefing room, the same map of the valley hung on the wall. Now it was littered with colored pins and strings. Red for friendly positions during the fight, blue for confirmed enemy hides, black for bodies recovered, yellow for unexploded ordnance. A projector cast grainy footage onto a portable screen. Aerial shots from artillery's observation drone, snippets from the surviving helmet cams, and fragments of recovered enemy video all spliced together. An intelligence officer in a clean uniform pointed with a laser. They intended to take the intel truck intact if possible, he said. You can see here, their initial fire patterns avoid catastrophic hits on its center mass. They aimed to disable, not destroy. At the same time, they targeted the lead and rear vehicles heavily to seal the column. The video showed the first explosions again, slowed. Flames erupted. Snow plumed. Their main objective was likely in that truck, he continued. We know it contained encryption modules and keys that, if captured, would allow them to impersonate our traffic for some time. Combine that with this. He clicked, and a still shot from a captured laptop appeared. It showed a crude map of the pass, the valley, and arrows pushing through toward the interior. And you get a plan, he said. Blind the brigade, seize keys, then push a larger force into the pass while we're still trying to figure out why everything's suddenly dark. A side benefit would be footage of captured troops for propaganda broadcasts. They had cameras pre-positioned on the ridges. We've recovered several. Mason sat at the table, his arm in a sling. Harper sat beside him, a bandage on his head. Ortiz leaned against the back wall, eyes red from lack of sleep. The medic dozed in a chair, head down, only waking when the projector's hum changed. At the far end of the table, Nadia sat with her hands folded around a cup of coffee gone cold. Her palms were bandaged under the gloves. Frostbite and rope burns from the climb had left their marks. The intelligence officer clicked again. New footage rolled. Now the scene zoomed in on the ridge where the larger jammer had been. The angle was from some recovered enemy camera. It showed their commander, face obscured by a scarf, gesturing at the jammer, then turning to look down the valley. A muzzle flash, tiny and bright, flickered from an unseen spot on the ridge opposite. There was a brief pause, then the jammer tore itself apart. The commander's body flew backward, frame jerking. The room was silent except for the projector. The officer cleared his throat. Who was on that ridge? He asked, though he already knew. Several heads turned slowly toward Nadia. Mason looked too, his gaze steady. She was, he said. The officer nodded once, not in surprise, but acknowledgement. Your file says your primary role is marksman attached to a line squad, he said to her. Yet you had no spotter, no dedicated partner, and your equipment was less than ideal. I had what I needed, she said. Her voice sounded different in this quiet room than it had in the valley. Softer, but with a core that had not melted in the days since. "But you climbed," he said. "Against instructions." She met his gaze. "I climbed with instructions," she replied. "They were just verbal, not in a manual." Mason's mouth twitched. The officer let that pass. "You noticed that rock formation before the mission," the intel man continued. "You raised it in the briefing." "Yes," she said. "Why were you so certain it mattered?" he asked. She shrugged slightly. "The snow line was wrong," she said. "The way the drifts piled up around it. There were prints leading up to it, no prints leading past. The cable was visible even from the outpost. It was the kind of thing you'd build if you wanted a place to plug your toys into. If I were planning an ambush, I want a node right there." "You've planned ambushes before?" he asked, half a joke. She ignored the tone. "I spent enough time on ranges and exercises," she said. "People show you all the ways to kill you. You either learn or you don't." The officer clicked again. Helmet cam footage from Harper's gear now played, black borders marking where he'd fallen and the camera had tilted. Snippets of audio carried over. "Mortars are walking in. We need eyes on that ridge." "Rafik, you still think that ridge is our only play?" "Yes, sir." The voices echoed in the room, ghosts of that compressed moment. In the back, Ortiz shifted his weight. "She warned us before the mission," he said quietly. "Saw things no one wanted to slow down for. If she hadn't been so stubborn about that ridge, we'd all be under it now." Mason nodded. "I denied her first request," he said, "because the book says you hold your shooters close in an ambush. The book was written for easier days than this one." The intelligence officer tapped his pen on the table, thinking. "There's also this," he said. "Your training record, Corporal. You were on track for a dedicated sniper slot before a live-fire incident." He flipped to another projected document. The reprimand glowed faintly on the wall. Words like deviation, unauthorized movement, potential endangerment stood out in bold. "In that exercise, your lane was compromised by a malfunctioning target system," he read. A trainee froze in the wrong sector. Instructors were about to hit the halt, but before they could, you left your designated lane to drag him clear of fire. In the confusion, a round went high. No one was hurt, but the rules were clear. You broke them. You were removed from the sniper pipeline. He looked at her, one eyebrow raised. "Would you do it differently now?" he asked. She thought of the trainee's eyes that day, wide and empty, locked on a sight picture he didn't understand anymore. The way his hands trembled. The way the instructors had started to shout, realization dawning too slowly. "No," she said. The officer smiled faintly. "Thought so," he said. "Funny thing, that same habit saved a few dozen more lives this time." Mason leaned forward. "I'm submitting an amendment to that report," he said. "And to hers. This valley should be in that file, right next to that training range. Anyone reading it in the future should see the pattern." "What pattern?" the officer asked. Mason's eyes were tired, but clear. "She moves when other people freeze," he said. "Regulations catch up later." The intelligence officer shut off the projector. "When this gets written up," he said, "we'll call it what it was, a unit fighting its way out of a well-planned trap, with help from someone who refused to stay in the trap's design." He closed his folder. "There'll be no medal ceremony right away," he added. "You know how it is. Paperwork, politics, people arguing commas. But your names are on the reports. All of you." The medic snorted softly. "I don't need a medal," he muttered. "I'd settle for boots that don't leak." Soft laughter rippled around the table. Later, at a small memorial near the outpost's far Hesco wall, they gathered around a line of wooden crosses and metal plaques. The names etched into them were fresh. Snow dusted their tops, melting in small tears. Nadia stood at the end of the line, gloved hands around something small and brass. Ortiz approached, breath fogging. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, though the word meant little now. Okay, men alive. Beyond that, it was all negotiation. She knelt and placed the spent casing from the shot into the snow at the base of one of the crosses. The name there belonged to a driver from the rear truck. He had died when the second blast flipped his vehicle. Her shot hadn't reached him. Couldn't have. She didn't pretend one round could balance those scales. It hadn't been fired for that. It was just a piece of the story, and she didn't want it in her pocket anymore. She rose, snow clinging to her knee. "I thought you'd keep that," Ortiz said softly. She shrugged. "It belonged to all of us," she said. "Not just me." He looked at the line of markers, hands jammed into his pockets. "I still say you're bad at taking praise," he said. She almost smiled. "Good," she replied. "Maybe people will stop trying." Weeks later, when the worst of winter eased and the valley's drifts settled, she went back up to the ridge. Officially, she was out with a small patrol to verify that no new devices had been tucked into old hides. Unofficially, she wanted to see the place again without the fog of adrenaline. The slope felt different under her boots this time. Familiar, like a staircase she'd used many times. The rock formation stood as it had, though the repeater box was gone, blown apart or hauled away. Scorch marks stained the stone. She lay prone in the same hollow, the repaired optic cool against her cheek. The world below spread out calm and clear. The road had fresh tire tracks now, from engineers and salvage crews. The wrecks were gone, leaving only faint scars and darker patches in the snow where fires had burned. No muzzle flashes winked from the ridges. No mortar rounds shrieked. Just the wind, humming softly, and the distant growl of an engine. From here, the valley looked small, contained. It was hard to reconcile this view with the memory of feeling utterly trapped down there, staring up at these same rocks like the walls of a cage. She knew that from the bottom, you never saw the person on the ridge clearly. Just the effects, mortars going quiet, guns falling silent, an RPG round that never fired. To most of them, she would remain a rumor, a statement in an after-action report, a line in a citation, eventually if someone pushed it through, an anecdote to tell new soldiers about how sometimes the plan falls apart and someone has to climb where they weren't originally told to. She shifted, letting her eye roam the slopes, imagining future threats, future rock formations that weren't quite right. Fear would always be part of it. The valley would always be a place where things could go very wrong. No amount of marksmanship changed that. But fear, she had learned long ago, didn't have to dictate function. You could carry both. You could feel your hands shake and still know how to count breaths, how to read wind, how to decide which target mattered first. Her radio crackled, bringing her back. "Ridge team, this is base," a voice said. "You see anything interesting up there?" She pressed the transmit key. "Just snow and old ghosts," she replied. "Route looks clean for now." "Copy that. Come on home. Coffee's almost fresh." She lingered one more minute, letting her gaze trace the path her rounds had taken that day in her memory. The spotter's knob, the machine gun nest, the RPG team, the jammer casing, and the man in the cap. She thought of the intel officer's words, of Mason's calm defense of her choices, of Ortiz's terrible jokes, of Harper's hands shaking as he calculated fire missions on a tablet smeared with blood. One woman, one rifle, one shot that had, in one moment, tipped a valley's fate. It wasn't true, of course. There had been many shots, many decisions, many hands hauling sleds of wounded, many feet digging trenches in the snow. No story like that belonged to one person. Still, stories needed a spine, something for people to remember when they tried to make sense of chaos. She pulled back from the scope and turned her head to look at the valley with her naked eye. It looked smaller without magnification, but still bigger than any one life. Her breath fogged once more in the cold. "In a world counted in thousands of rounds," she said under her breath, "they'll remember the ones that changed the numbers." Then she rolled out of the hollow, slung the rifle over her shoulder, and started down, leaving the ridge to its quiet.